So as the next panel comes up to the stage, I'm actually going to make a couple of comments. You guys come on. About Stacy Ensing Singh, who's now a venture partner at Lightstone, but I think we all know her best from her prior role at Covidian and as a leader in the medtech space. And it's actually very related and relevant to this current conversation about leadership and mentoring and you know, being the person and setting the example that others want to be, not because they have to, but because they want to. And when Amy and I were throwing around this idea for what would become the MedtechVision conference, you know, circa 2010-ish, we needed an anchor tenant, and we knew we were going to need an anchor tenant. You need somebody to lead the round. You can't do this for free. The Rosewood expects us to write a check. And so we went around and talked to a number of different people that we considered mentors and executives that we respected to see if A, this was a good idea, and B, if they thought that there was money available to help us pay for it in the form of a nonprofit, and C, would they perhaps be one of those people? And Stacy was one of the people that raised her hand, I would say not only immediately, but repeatedly. So Stacy, thank you for your original support of MedtechVision, your unwavering support across the years of MedtechVision, and for moderating this panel today. And with that, I will let you take it from here and tell us all about how we're going to get things funded in new markets.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Deb, and I just want to congratulate the team for another amazing conference. Actually, every year when I put together my personal growth agenda, MedTech conference is on it. And I have been to each one of these, and every year I just gain so much insight. And today I gained, again, incredible insight. It is true that I am one of the people that have answered back to Alex, who I thought was a real person and not. And I just learned today that Lori's assistant, who helped me with this, is not a real person. So that was fascinating to me. And
the name was Amy Ingram, AI.
AI?
Yeah, artificial.
No, yeah, Alex, I know. Clearly I was confused. And then I also thought, you know, just so many of the panelists were interesting. And Jane Chen earlier, I thought that was an incredible technology. And if you guys somebody wants to run with this, I really think that there is a large lotus blanket that could be created for the postmenopausal women so that they can sleep comfortably and be temperature regulated. So I'm hoping to see that next year, the large lotus blanket. And then lastly, I just really want to compliment Erica and Sandra for your shoe colors. I am going to move into the magenta jewel tones in my next conference. But I am so pleased to be able to have this group here today. I don't have a clicker, so if someone can advance the slide, and share with you this incredible panel that we have assembled. I know we're the last panel of the day, but I think we'll be pretty engaging. And a big part of that is because there's probably no greater global topic than how to attract and deploy capital. I mean, that is certainly what is the foundation for allowing innovation to go forward. And candidly, it's the foundation for countries around the world to grow their capabilities for their populations, and it really is an important topic. And that's what we're going to endeavor to do today. So with me on this panel, to my left, your right, Dr. Milena Adamian. How well did I do that? Better?
Almost there.
Say it.
Adamian.
Adamian. Okay, thank you. And I've known Milena for a while. Milena is the managing director, really instigator for Azimuth Ventures. She's also an MD. She has just had an incredible, I think, insight on some of the early innovative companies, including some of the digital technology and e-health companies, which we're going to talk about. And Lisa Wipperman-Heine I know how to say that name because I have worked with Lisa. Probably one of the best hires that I ever made was to bring Lisa into EB3. She ran our clinical organization and ultimately went on to run that with Covidian, and now is the COO of MitraLine, and I'm just so personally happy to see that because I can recall conversations years ago where I just said, Lisa, you know, I think you would make an amazing, if you will, general management leader. I mean, you've got an incredible foundation in clinical, regulatory, and reimbursement, but you have a tremendous strategic insight, and I want to see you bring that forward into our company. And so now to see her running MitraLine is fantastic. And then to my right, Renee Ryan. I think so many people know Renee because of all of the work that she's done both at JJDC but also previous in the investment banking world. And so Renee Ryan now is the Vice President for JJDC. And I am proud to say that at this panel, we comprise almost 100 years of combined med tech experience, and we look good for 100 years. I'm just saying. That's why we need the blanket. That's why I need the blanket. Like right now, I'm totally having a halfway. Okay. The other thing that I wanted to do was to just give just a couple of comments that maybe create a foundation that we can just all be aware of. And that is that oftentimes we, hear about the entirety, if you will, of investment in med tech. And by and large, while it's a little bit down, the reality is we have almost $10 billion that's going into healthcare broadly, which is described as basically biopharma, device, and then diagnostics. Now, I actually was trying to find, and this data, some of it is from Silicon Valley Bank. I was kind of trying to do some internet researching to actually understand, with all of this new consumerization of health and digital health, e-health, if there was a clean bucket to understand how much investment is there. Because my instinct would be, and I couldn't find anything, and if somebody knows this, it would be interesting for you to share it with the group. I think if you actually incorporated that, in my opinion, and it's just an opinion, I think actually investment would be up. But those get hidden right now into kind of consumer and IT services. And that, I think, is just an interesting call to action for all of us. We saw some technologies earlier today and companies that are really getting to this intersection, if you will, of healthcare, consumerization, e-health. We've actually had some med tech conferences on that in the past. So in total, you can read the data here. It's, I think, a pretty strong picture and still a strong opportunity as it relates to investing in good ideas and seeing those good ideas go forward. Now, the next thing that I thought was interesting, and some of this was also talked about earlier, is kind of where is the money coming from? So again, this is just kind of an aggregate perspective, but one of the things that I find fascinating is that the United States has, historically, of course, been the powerhouse as it relates to healthcare innovation as well as healthcare investment. And this does not specifically go into healthcare, but I think that it is an important call to action that there are many economies around the world that have the wherewithal, the financial ability to invest in innovation, and they desire to invest in innovation. And obviously, China has been talked about earlier. It's quite significant, the financial resources that they have. We're going to talk about that a little bit. And there tends to be a desire from many Chinese investors to actually exit their investment out of China. They don't want the dollars trapped in China. So for those of you that are innovating and looking to have your companies funded, you can see the variety of different financial resources here, but I think it is important to look beyond the United States because there are real opportunities there. And then lastly, where we're really going to focus, this was just pulled off, the internet, the the source is Google Images. I couldn't drill down deeper than that. I'm sure it's originally from some textbook, so I apologize to the original inventor of this schematic, but I got it on Google. And but I think it's important because one of the other things that we hear about, and I think it's the generalization in healthcare, that it's venture capital, private equity, corporate strategics, where the money really is. And that's true. That's a big part of it. But you can see that there are actually multiple sources of funding, and those funding sources are important. Lisa Sunan just said, hey, if you want to write a check as an individual, friends and family is an important place to start oftentimes. But obviously there's a laddering up that takes place. I thought it was very interesting earlier that a couple of the CEOs talked about their investment has come from family funds, personal investors. So there really are sources of capital broadly that are out there. But what we're really going to do, I think, although I will be interested if some of you have some thoughts on other sources of capital other than what you represent, is we're really going to spend most of our time kind of in that venture capital and strategic investor category, but we would, of course, welcome questions broadly. And I'm going to actually start with Renee, and I'm going to start with Renee with the first question really being that, when you're a developing company and you tend to get strategic investor investment, to some level, it's a badge of credibility for that company and that technology. So what I'd love to do is maybe if you could share with the group, your framework on what's the investment thesis, what do you look for, what kinds of things do you take into consideration before you deploy your capital into a technology or a company?
Sure, happy to. So JDDC has been around since the 70s, which is really when the venture capital industry was born. And the only thing that affords us is I think we've made every mistake in the book. But the one beauty of that whole history that we've had of being in existence for 40-something years is that the mission and charter that we wrote back in the 70s still exists today. And that consistency, I think, has served us well, maybe because it's sort of that true north. Our objective is to invest in opportunities that create strategic options and strategic pipeline additions for Johnson & Johnson. So that's where we start with every investment. And I think one of the hardest things for startup companies, to be honest, is that you don't necessarily know what our strategic plan has in store for us, where we do. And so we look out a number of years and look at areas and diseases that are of keen importance across the globe and try to invest where the puck will be. And so that's where you've seen some of our different investment themes and things we've looked at, especially in oncology. Those are informed by a strategic plan that is well vetted within the organization as to where we think disease treatments need to go. The beauty of being only strategic is that we are also stage agnostic and check size agnostic. So it makes our ability to deploy capital in a very efficient way in that we're giving the right amount of capital and the right ownership stake to a company at the right time and can also invest over the long haul of a company's existence.
And so let me ask you just one quick follow-up that it made me think of when you were talking. If you're a company and you generally recognize what the J&J strategic plan is, but you don't know where you're going, I mean, is there some insight on how you think a company should come and pitch to you? Should they at all try and incorporate the where the puck is going, or how do you look for that in an investment?
So two ways to answer that question. One is I think we've actually gotten a lot better about disclosing our strategic priorities. And so the whole Johnson & Johnson innovation, which is for where JJDC is now one of the companies within that. It's also our 4 innovation centers across the globe. It's also our J-Labs incubators that now have 6 sites and 120 companies housed in those sites. We've actually made a concerted effort to put more on the internet of saying, here are the areas that we have that are in our scope, are of interest, whether it's a category like oncology or very specifically prostate cancer, and try to be a little more transparent to the audience that we're trying to attract. So that's one way that we've been doing that. There's also I think the beauty of being a strategic investor and sort of everyone at J&J playing on the same team is that we're very agnostic as to where a company comes into. I don't get a sourcing credit per se if an investment comes to me first versus a business development or an R&D colleague. Mm-hmm. We have so many open doors, we call the red doors of J&J. They're everywhere. And so our goal as JJDC is to be efficient and to get you to the right spot for that conversation at that time. Oftentimes, a company is not really looking for an investment, they're looking for an earlier relationship or maybe a distribution deal. So my goal is to get you to the right person within J&J to help you make those decisions.
Okay, cool. So Milena, I'm going to go to you because I think you compare and contrast, or that's what I'd like you to do. Running your own fund, it's obviously smaller in scope than Johnson & Johnson. So what's your investment thesis? What do you look for? And what are the components that are going to attract you to deploy capital?
Well, maybe I should describe a fund, just
Perfect.
So it's not Lightstone. So the fund is
big, medium, micro.
and between us, we actually represent the perfect VC, but I'll talk about it later. So the fund is so I graduated medical school in 1992, and then in 2003, my career took a different path. And I ended up at Boston Scientific as one of the medical directors. And then for the last 9 years, I've been in venture. And so for 5 years ago, for a number of reasons, I decided to do my own fund. And so one of the reasons was to basically create my own track record and see what I can actually do by myself, right? And so for that reason, you do start small. And hopefully you grow. And so what dictates really your investment thesis is the goal. What do you want to do with that fund? Are you planning to stay forever small, or you want to grow? And so since I always have an ambition to grow, even though height has no correlation to that, so I thought this is great. I'm going to start building it slowly and just one kind of step at a time. And so, as a small fund, what you have to have first, so you understand, you want to grow, you want to have a discipline in investing, a specific discipline. You want to make sure that you don't do anything stupid. So what is also important is that when you are an early stage investor, you're not just a money manager. And I really don't like that definition. You are more of a resource to a company. And so one of the things that you're trying to accomplish is you can get money anywhere, right? You just showed the map. The key is to basically, how do you attract those who you like, those companies that you like? How do you basically sell yourself to them and say, hey, this is the right, so I don't have 20 million to deploy, but this is what we have, but we can do so much more together. And so that's one of the very important things that you use in a small fund by trying to build both your portfolio relationship with your companies and being useful. So that's other very important thing for the smaller small.
And are there specifically, you mentioned your kind of investment parameters, your thesis. Throw out kind of just the top 3 things that as things are coming across, you're looking and saying, I like that, I don't like that, I like that.
When I started it, so I'm a hardcore medtech person, right? When I started, I thought naively in mid-2011, I thought that it's going to be mostly medtech. Things have changed, and I can tell you that 70% of our portfolio right now is health IT, and by no means it's the fashionable thing. It's just because some of those companies happen to be on the intersection of technology and devices, and I think answering your question where it goes, we're probably going to cover that. That's where it's going to go. So it's what we called now, the thesis is not medtech but tech med. Remember we
talked about that?
Yeah, we talked about that. So it's a tech med. It's whatever technology can enable, and there's a lot of technology intervention that could make things better. We're seeing this push from, no, it's not a push. It's a demand. It's a necessity from big companies, from small companies. You need to work on your margins and so on and so forth. So medical device companies also going into that direction. So again, criteria, team, market and team. So I can't say enough about the team. Market has to be there first.
And with team, so what's your advice if you're a company out there? How do you pitch the team? What do you want to see? Because, you know, in some of this, call it health, IT, or tech med area, you get a lot of first-time CEOs, you know, a lot of pedigrees that are different from the classic med tech. So if you dig, you know, underneath that, what are you looking for?
Well, I want someone very charismatic, young or old, whatever. It has to be someone who you can see he's going to figure it out. The other thing, what you want to hear is from them is that they do respect your age. No, what I'm saying age is actually the experience. Speaking of tech med, right?
Yeah.
If someone comes in and tries to recreate something that is existing without understanding what went into building it, it's very difficult. It's impossible. So I had a conversation with one of our CEOs. He was trying to tell me, I'm going to revolutionize so-and-so without going into details. And I tell him, look, maybe I sound like a woman, but before trying to revolutionize how you're going to make a shoe, you have to understand how they were made before, right? So somehow I got this shoe example, but it has to be charismatic, someone willing to listen and learn. Yeah. Learn what he doesn't know, learn what he, understanding his limitations.
Yes.
My first MedTech woman meeting was back in 2009 in a small room here, and it was Fairlyn who was giving her speech, by the way. And I remember very clearly what she said. She said, I knew exactly what I don't know, and that's why I hired very bright people to help me with that. Mm-hmm. So
important skill.
That's what you're looking for in your CEOs, basically.
So Lisa's on the different side of the equation, as I mentioned, running a company, and they just went through a successful raise, so congratulations on that. Can you kind of paint for the group, how did you talk about what money you wanted to take if you were in that position? Sometimes you're not. But what was the role of the management team in that? How did the board help? And just how did you think about what kind of investment you wanted to take?
Well, I'm Lisa from North Dakota, just like Dorothy from Kansas, and I put the G in global, so you know that's why they brought me on board for this latest fund. All jokes aside, we're going back about 10 years. We're 75% OUS funded, with our #1 investor out of the Netherlands. And thinking in this latest fund, you know, you're in the post-apocalyptic time with the U.S. Market, and while there's still good VC, I think Stacy could even tell you that there's not as much competition when they're looking at potential investments. So the valuations have gone down significantly in the U.S., and it created an opportunity for us to look creatively outside the U.S. And China, as has been mentioned several times today, was an area where the valuations were significantly higher. And they view the U.S. market as very innovative, and so there's a desire to make those investments. So that became a good starting point. If you want to bring value to your shareholders and have higher valuations, it was a good place to look. The challenge for us is, though, that it requires a significant amount of time and effort to go into China. And so you had to really leverage everything from leaders on our board to our CEO, and you really have to put the time in. And so, we talk about device entrepreneurs, and you talk a little bit about some of these tech med companies and what they need. I think the traditional device entrepreneurs, even for traditional non-IT type companies, really needs to be augmented with financial entrepreneurs, ones that know these alternative markets and can understand how to leverage them. So I think we leverage that in terms of having a board member who had strong relationships in Asia, and we could leverage those. And then when you put the time in and got an anchor investor, you can leverage that anchor investor to drive additional funding in China. That said, 1-800-Mitraline, anybody out here, we're willing to take as many steps.
You know, just an interesting comment on that because, Lisa, to your point on boards, you know, it's interesting with the earlier stage companies, the majority of the board members tend to be the investors. But I think that for those of you that are working with your companies and have the ability to influence who's on the board, it is really quite valuable to have the independent director role. And specifically to think about what your needs are as you're going to grow that company and bringing on a director that specifically can fill that need. I've been working in a director capacity with a couple of companies, and it's been very interesting for me to see at both the public company level as well as now at the, you know, VC or early stage funded company level, how fortunately now chairwomen are becoming more sophisticated at thinking about what is my board makeup so that I can either attract future capital or that I can bring some expertise onto the board that I can match with my management team. And you know, I think when it comes to looking at this outside the United States investment ability, I know that was a big advantage for Mitraline. And so I think that would be an interesting takeaway for everyone to just objectively think about. If I look at our board, what are we missing on our board that can help us ultimately either with, you know, operating capability or very importantly, financing capability when you're a younger organization.
Just to your point, we just, you know, we closing another investment in that tech medical IoT call it. And one of the, and these are first-time entrepreneurs, exceptional people. Again, very young, energetic, very charismatic, and really willing to do a lot of things. But they, so we discussed the board composition. We have an independent, and I said, guys, you have to have it. This is someone who's going to bring industry experience, and specifically industry experience in where they're trying to launch. Okay. So I got my medtech background, that's okay. But we need to bring in someone else. And so that is critical, and that comes as a result of, you know, kind of working with a number of those and really feeling the need and seeing the value of independent director.
Absolutely.
Incredible.
I think the other thing is when you have a board member that can do that, you also still have to realize you may have your CEO has to spend a significant amount of time looking at those alternative fundings. It's a full-time job for a startup company. And so when they're spending the time on that, there's the traditional activities inside the company that still have to be managed, because in Asia and China, it's not as transactional as we're used to. It's very relationship foundation, so you can't do drive-by presentations. You can't just go in and out. A lot of times what will happen is literally go in, present, you'll stay there for a week or two, and you'll literally come back to them again. And that says a lot to them about your commitment to them and to the fund.
So maybe continuing on kind of the outside the United States piece, Renee, can you talk about, in your experience, either the syndicate type partners that are outside the U.S.? How do you think about what makes a good quality investment partner that may be looking at some of the same investments? As well as I know you guys have put some money to work in other markets outside the U.S.
Right.
And so maybe just, you know, share some of those insights.
Yeah, from our perspective, we actually are agnostic. I keep saying agnostic as to where our company is located. We have investors in China, Israel, Europe, and obviously the U.S. And so from our perspective, we've invested in all of those regions. We've invested with local partners. We have very deep relationships with them. So they're critically important. As you know, as a corporate investor, we have restrictions on how much of an ownership stake we can have in a company. So syndication is our #1 priority. So that's a lot of what we do, is making sure we have dibs on or relationships with those key people who are actively investing in the various regions. We're obviously seeing a lot of investment from Asia, in particular into our US-based portfolio companies, and from my perspective, it's been welcome capital. It's very deep pockets, and they do bring additional capabilities to the table that can really help grow a company. And that's what the critical factor for us is can they bring something more than just money, especially when you have to worry about a 12 or 13-hour time difference, right? That's a pressure on a CEO. That's another added pressure to his or her day. The other thing we've done is we didn't feel that we had the right entrepreneurial network yet in Asia, and so we actually invested in, there's a local group here called Vivo Capital that has both offices here in Palo Alto. We know them well, we can see them frequently, but they also have a very keen strategy on being both domiciled in the US and in Asia with very large teams. And so our medical device business chose to invest in Vivo Capital's latest fund, and we've been able to increase our deal flow and access the more entrepreneurial community through that partnership.
So that's a pretty interesting concept. So you're actually taking your venture investment, in effect, and investing it in another venture fund.
Correct.
And the purpose for that is relationship, would you say, primarily, or how do you value that?
It's valued as a strategic relationship, right? And it's valued not just for the portfolio companies they invest in, but importantly, Vivo runs, they run the Chinese Healthcare Investment Conference in the spring. We've had keynote speakers there and been participant of the conference, expanding our network in that way. We also they do a BD conference, I think it's next week in Shanghai, that we participate at and have one-on-one meetings with all the entrepreneurs. So for us, it's really almost a Rolodex building activity for both investors and also entrepreneurs in the region.
Interesting. And Milena, you've worked with some capital outside the U.S., Russia, correct? Or what is your what's your experience there in considering who to partner with or how to attract capital outside the U.S.? What are you seeing?
I mean, I have to confess, I never took money from anyone other than U.S. investors.
Okay.
Or my friends. I mean, they're Russian, but they're not by any means any major investors. But so I mean, as a smaller fund, I would say as an early stage fund, because we're growing, and there will be another one that's going to continue to focus on exactly the same stage and sector. I would not invest in the companies outside of U.S.
You would not?
I would not. I would expand to other geographies for sure. But as an investor, I think specifically for a smaller, at the early stage, you need a lot of hand-holding. You need a lot of attention and working with your companies, and obviously not. I mean, I don't want to overemphasize the role of venture capitalists. I mean, after all, but they're CEOs who are running, there's a team who runs the company. But I would not invest in a company outside of the U.S. But I would leverage all my capabilities and network if we have to expand the market. That being said, market expansion also has to be very careful because, as you said, it's all relationship, right? So you cannot all of a sudden just pop up in China and say, hey, we're going to expand here. You have to have people on the ground. It's all relationship based. And so if it's expansion to India, then it has to be someone we know very well in India who is local, who can do a call, can do checks, and so on and so forth.
Okay. It's interesting when I was reading some entrepreneurs, and now I'm embarrassed, I can't remember his first name, but somebody Thiel, the big guy that started LinkedIn, thank you.
PayPal.
Don't tell him I didn't know his name when I'm out here in Silicon Valley. But he actually was giving a talk, and he talked about the fact that from his perspective, it was the relationship network that's actually the currency. That's the new currency. Yeah. And that if you're not leveraging basically the social media connectivity for, whether it's your own brand or your own network capability, you're missing out on an opportunity. And so I thought that was a good reminder, especially because for me, just coming into the VC world this past March, it's a new experience for me. That has been very fascinating to me, is to just see the amount of relationships across the investment side and all of the entrepreneurs. And Milena talked about the importance of a team. That's been fascinating as well, just to see how there are individuals that are bankable, and I swear they could just walk in and they could pick up the investment for a new company. So I think that's an interesting little call to action for everyone, putting a plug there for C-Sweetener. is not just about mentoring, it's also about networking, and that is a powerful investment that we all can make. So Lisa, one of the things that I think is interesting, it's been talked about a little bit earlier, is classically in the past, a lot of companies thought about get the reg approval outside the U.S., commercialize outside the U.S. That's, obviously the best path to go from 0 to 1. And when you think about your financial investor, the emotion aside, what they're looking for is a return as fast as possible. So how do you think about now in running a company, a technology, that consideration for where we're going to commercialize and getting your investors and your board, on par with you for that?
Well, I think in terms of commercialization, I'm going to even back it up further. First, you have foundationally, for a lot of these Class 3 devices, you have to have data. And traditionally, you went to other geographies and started there because it was quicker. For example, we have 2 products. We have a mitral valve repair product, and we have a tricuspid valve repair. The mitral valve project was done some years ago, and where did they do the first cases? Paraguay, Colombia, Poland, Europe, and Western Europe. For tricuspid, let's flash forward to a year ago, and where did they do the first cases under clinical trial? The US. How often does that happen? And they started a parallel path with things in Europe and here, and we were, I think, the first company to finish our early feasibility study in the structural heart space. So it had benefited us tremendously, and I think the collaboration the FDA has and the interactivity they've had with really trying to build that here and allow us to do more patients. I think the reverse might happen for us in that we have more patients contributing to our CE mark approval from the US than we do from Europe. Or we've had those discussions where in the past it used to be, well, gee, can we use, I remember this from EV3, we have this new device, can we use this all OUS data for our FDA submission? So it really, if you would have told me 5 years ago this was going to be the case, or even 2 or 3 years ago when FDA first started talking about that program, I would have told you it's never going to work. So it is really, I think, a paradigm shift for how we think about speed and getting things done. The other advantage of it is, a lot of times you go into pivotal stage, these trials become your market development activities prior to launching. And to have a lot of this early experience with some of these US centers for this important market has been tremendous. And again, advocacy when you think of strategics and having these folks have experience with the device when they're out talking, when they're on the podium, when you're engaging them with other VCs, it has been a tremendous advantage for us.
So I shared a slide earlier of the map of investment broadly coming from a lot of different countries, and so I'll kind of open this up to the panel. If you were to project out, over the course of the next 5 to 10 years, how do you think that map will change? And for the entrepreneurs, CEOs, and innovators, what do you think that means they need to be thinking about or do in order to stay pertinent to that capital?
Sorry.
Sure.
That was a question. How it will change? I mean, first of all, it could shrink. I think it might shrink a little bit because
the total funding.
We've seen overflowing funds specifically in those areas that you mentioned that are not probably accounted for, but they are for. A lot of money has been thrown out there. There was also a publication recently, about 2 weeks ago. I forgot. We're all kind of having memory issues here. I forgot where it was published. It talked about the really very entrepreneur-unfriendly terms coming with those unlimited checks from overseas. And so a lot of entrepreneurs and companies starting to get to realization that this is basically screwing them up. Okay, so those are tough terms. So you either take money on those terms or decide what you're going to do next, right? So whatever the balance is going to change, and I do believe that U.S. will continue to be the lead, because ultimately even a lot of money sources, capital sources coming from overseas, a lot of them want to come and kind of become LPs in the U.S. funds. Yeah, some of them very clearly indicated, we want to invest in a fund, we want to become LPs, we want to learn how to do it from you guys first, and then we'll do something on our own, which is fine too, but I'm just saying it's still going to be, I think U.S. will still dominate, but that's my opinion.
Renee, any bets?
Yeah,
what you're seeing?
In life sciences, I get the benefit of being J&J is one of the founding sponsors of a grant program called MedTech Innovator. It's our 4th year of existence. We've had rising submissions every year, and this year we had 430 applicants from across the globe, and a lot of them very early stage, bootstrapped, friends and family funded medical device companies that, I gotta say, I got shivers. I was reading some of these business plans, and there's real innovation happening out there, and it's really exciting. And so maybe I'm naive, but a lot of the submissions we saw were from Europe and the US, and there are people who are making it happen out there. And so I continue to believe those two markets will continue to serve up most of our medical device innovation. One of the areas that we're spending a little more time on as a company, as you know, J&J has a consumer business as well, is the whole rise of the consumerization of healthcare. We're looking at a lot of consumer medtech opportunities, a lot of digital health opportunities, and have made a handful of investments in that area and have, surprisingly done very well. I mean, companies are, because they don't have sort of the burden of the FDA, they're moving at warp speed and making stuff happen. And so it's pretty exciting for us. And we're going to look at different ways to access those companies, whether it's through accelerator programs or incubators or other sort of entrepreneurial sources of innovation.
And I'd be interested in your thoughts. Scott Hunnekens is now running Verb Surgical, right?
Yes,
and you're working there, J&J, Google. I mean, are you starting to see, call it new strategics, that if you were looking out, you could think be a place of investment that either, certainly a digital tech company, but a classic med tech company would ever go to, like they do with the strategics today? Yeah,
the vision that, I was actually on sort of the founding team that took, and if you've read David Katz's article, he disclosed sort of where it all came from. We had funded some work at SRI, which is where the original intuitive surgical robot was developed. J&J went in and funded work for a number of years, and then the goal really was, there's sort of lofty goals around democratization of surgery and creating a sort of very lower profile, much more mobile type of solution, but also enabled with 21st century technology. So things like machine learning and AI and automation became kind of interesting, maybe not for the first generation product we'll launch, but in future generations to make it really the right technology in robotic surgery for the 21st century. I think Google was our #1 pick as a partner, and so
what do you like about them?
They had the breadth and capabilities. They had already made many plays in the field of robotics. Robotics is hard. It incorporates a lot of hardware and software capabilities that we felt we didn't necessarily have the ability, especially on the software side as J&J, to take that project forward. And so linking arms with them to create Verb Surgical, I think, was great. And we got lucky. I mean, Scott was free after selling Volcano. This is his 3rd JJDC company. So he felt very at home with us. And so now he's gone from 1 employee last August to, I think they're close to 90 and will be over 100 by year end. Yeah, it's growing like a weed. It's great. They're making a lot of great progress.
Very cool.
Yeah, very proud of that one.
So it was brought up, Erica brought up earlier, and I totally believe in this, that it's through a lot of your failures that you achieve success. Would the 3 of you mind sharing, something that comes to mind that's been a failure, either in deploying the capital or an experience that you've had that now you're rethinking and it comes up differently in your investment thesis? Milena.
All right, failure.
Yeah, why not?
No. I mean, successes are there. I mean, I wouldn't. We'll touch them later.
Yeah, we'll end on a high.
Well, I mean, to be honest, ever since I started to invest, I had one failure. It was a failure that taught me a lot, and it taught me a lot as an investor. There were several levels of that, right? So, without going into details and naming names, it was a company that I thought was the most de-risked company in my portfolio. I had not expected that the company of that stage with investors that, with investors of that kind and caliber would go, and also with my experience in medtech and never seen a company going down in a year and a half from being from having incredible technology that didn't fail, just going under. So a number of lessons learned, and one of them, a couple of them, they're important. I don't know if there are investors in this audience. I would say that don't bank a lot on something that, even if you think this is the best thing ever that happened to you, you might be all wrong, no matter how well you due diligence them and how, there's always a Titanic out there. Okay, so second, so seriously, and then second part that the other lesson that I learned, I was one of those teams that I actually, when you never substitute your gut feeling for anything else. I mean, it's, if you looking at CEO and go like, yeah, he's a cool guy, but maybe, yeah. And then you start rationalizing and you start thinking, well, yeah, maybe it's just, this is the way I think about it. These people who invested, they probably knew what they were doing. That was a stupid mistake. And so I paid for it. But that's funny, as I said, it was the most de-risked deal, and it was the syndicated deal, because all 13 companies in which we invested before, we were first investors. We didn't lead all of them, but we were definitely first investors, and we were followed up by amazing investors after that. This one was a syndication deal. So there are a lot of lessons learned, but just don't,
ignore your gut.
Don't ignore your gut, and just be very mindful and be disciplined about the amount. If you decide you're not going to allocate more than X to a specific company, you shouldn't be doing that. Even if Jesus Christ is on the board. I mean, seriously. I mean, it doesn't really matter.
I'm sorry. He's back.
How's that?
Any thoughts that you have, Renee or Lisa?
Well, I've made so many mistakes. It's hard to, I think you learn from the mistakes that you do. So I look at startup world, and I think of the startups that I've been involved in over my career, and I think of the times that we were successful and the times that we weren't. And the times that we were not successful was we didn't have a laser focus on what we needed to accomplish. And when you have a limited amount of capital and a limited runway, you're looking at that burn rate every month. And I think to be very specific about what your objectives are and what your goals are, and not to deviate from that and have that discipline, I think that's one of the challenges. And then getting the right team around, because too often what we do is we think, oh my gosh, 1,000 points of light, let's do this, let's do this. Gosh, what if this strategic wants this, or what if they want this? And you think too far ahead instead of saying, what do we need to do right now to deliver success with this? And I think one of the things that when I've seen failures professionally in my career, I think about at the end of the day, sometimes you have these amazing technologies, and we as an organization fail those technologies and the patient doesn't get the benefit. So I always think about it, we can't fail this, because we've seen the results, we know how these patients feel for many multitudes of these technologies. Let's get out of our own way and do the right thing by them, because at the end of the day, that's why every single person's in here, because we know we make a difference.
Well said. Renee?
Yeah, very well said. The good news is I've only been doing investing for 5 years, so I don't have many failures yet. But what I would say is there's the one situation where we've ultimately had to step away from a company based on where they strategically were going and where our strategic priorities were. We were at odds. When we made the investment, we were sort of all on the same page, and businesses grew apart. And I think part of that was not, and I think Melanie said, it was about the team, and it was the leadership of the company was not necessarily aligned with sort of J&J's credo and how we view opportunities and how we have a number one calling is to patients. And maybe we should have trusted our gut a little bit more in that early frenzy of putting out a term sheet and making the investment.
Let me open it up to questions, comments, shared stories back here. Oh, from the app. Alex. AI, back to you.
VR or whatever.
Can you turn this on? Oh, awesome. Okay. So from the app, are data security and privacy issues in different geographies impacting where medtech investments are going?
Yes, and regulations as well, right? So we have, so the same device that is 510K regulated in the US is a consumer device in you know, for example, in India, which is one of the companies we're investing right now. So, and while in the US you have to go through all those steps, you can literally put it on the shelf as an iPhone, and it's going to go to the hospital. So yeah, well, they are different. I mean, I don't know, they're different, but we also have different business models, different healthcare systems. So,
you know, one specific to the security comment, you know, back to some of the director work that I'm doing. I actually attended, and I would recommend it to anybody, this past April, the Stanford Board of Directors course. I think it's called the Directors Consortium. Leslie Trigg actually suggested to me that that might be something I'd be interested in. And they do it at Wharton and Chicago also. So there's 3 a year, but I did the Stanford course. And we actually had a half day on security. And I will tell you that with the 2 small companies that I'm working with that are private, all the way through to the 2 public companies, based on just the incredible importance of this and how swiftly it is changing, we are doing audits effectively on our, you know, cybersecurity risk, basically security insurance. There's really very interesting aspects between if you have an employee or even a director that is working off of their own device versus a company-issued device, how a lot of the insurance does not cover some potential risks that could happen. It's kind of a fascinating world, and the professor that taught it, it was interesting. He came in and, you know, professors always look so professorial, and he looked like a wreck. And, you know, he said right out of the gates, he said, you know, the reason why I look like I've been up all night is because I am like up all night every night, not to kind of make everybody afraid, but this thing is real. We were just hacked into at Stanford, and my message to you as a director is do not ignore this. My message to you as a CEO is do not ignore this. You know, spend some time on this understanding because it's very real, and company size is not necessarily the indicator of whether or not you will get, you know, attempted hacks or whatnot. So not only is it a patient privacy issue and a regulation issue, it can actually be something relative to just, you know, your own company's insurance and those types of things. And I'm talking about the hacking where they're trying to pull social security numbers and, you know, getting people to send monies to, you know, false accounts and all those types of things. Interesting question. Anything else?
Yes. How do you see data and connectivity becoming part of the medtech innovation and startups in the future?
Data connectivity.
Data and connectivity.
Oh, data and connectivity. Well, I think that's really this whole e-health, digital health component. So I know, Milena, it's 70% of your investment right now, roughly, is in this area. What are you seeing? What do you like in that? What do you look for?
well, it's an access to, I mean, I'm not going to say anything new, I mean, anything that you haven't heard or haven't read, but it is important. I mean, of course, connectivity and data, what it gives to us is, gives us a feedback mechanism, right? We understand better what's going on with a patient, with a workflow, can we improve clinical outcomes? Can we make the care more accessible? Do we really have to go for the high-cost devices, or there is a way to manage it on a more cost-efficient basis? I mean, there are so many advantages of actually understanding what's going on with you, right, versus not. Then I don't think this is debatable. it's already there.
Are there challenges with how the FDA looks at health IT? Do they understand it? Are they challenged?
There's always challenge with FDA, right? Wow.
But unique to the fact that it's something they're not used to seeing.
No, I think they actually, to be honest, FDA has done a pretty good job on things like that. And so there's a clear demarcation, right? I mean, they're traditional devices. Some of those devices are 510K devices, which is nothing new. Some of the e-health technologies has been really divided into buckets such as, if there's a clinical decision-making process, that's definitely more challenging and requires more time and so on and so forth. But there are also a lot of those services and solutions are simply translating or helping you to understand what's going on in the back end. So without really,
And Renee, would you say that J&J is trying to actively morph their investment portfolio, or how are you watching this?
Yeah, we are. We've got a number of initiatives on the digital health side. We actually, I think it's tomorrow or the next day, I'm spending, we have a health and wellness accelerator with Plug and Play where we're reviewing, I think 20 companies are coming into pitch, and they will ultimately be given grant money from J&J as they accelerate through the program. So we're looking at both partnerships like our announced partnership with Apple, sort of our red, white, and blue initiative, to the Google relationship for Verb Surgical, and then looking at a lot of smaller emerging technologies as well. We actually have, I think, something on the order of 450 apps that J&J has that you can go out and download from the App Store. We have a huge investment in our IT infrastructure, because if you think about it, there's a lot of technologies out there that can enhance even clinical trials. And a day in the life of a drug is huge in terms of to be able to get a drug to market faster. So we're looking at all areas of our business to create efficiencies using technologies, and I guess that falls under digital health because we're a healthcare company. But there's also things outside of healthcare that we think are really interesting.
So I mean, just right to that point. So we invested in a company that creates this interconnectivity between, basically it's a interoperability for clinical trials. That's one thing. It's not regulated at all, right? Then we've invested in a company that is it's a vital signs monitor, wearable vital signs monitor for infants, which is both medical device, and it's has tremendous amount of data that you can actually that could be helpful to understand what's going on with the child between the age of 0 and 18 months. So you can have insights in all kinds of symptoms, from desaturation to well-being, to sleep patterns, to feeding patterns. So it's the world out there, and the data is being monitored and derived every 2 seconds. So it is incredibly helpful. So, but that's a regulated device. So and there's okay. So it's regulated device on one hand, but on the other hand, it's actually right now you can buy it.
Consumer product.
It's a consumer product. Yeah.
Well, I think there's a few of those, right?
Right.
The question is the device statistically robust enough to be used, let's say, by the healthcare professional? As a crude demarcation between
exactly
the consumer
and oftentimes they actually are. They actually are legit. They absolutely same, because the diagnostic accuracy studies has been done, but yet you have to prove it. You have to kind of get it out there, because we know we came from the very robust medical device world. You need to support whatever you say with the data. You need to win physician, clinician, and clinician doesn't take anything other than data.
Questions? Yes, please.
Going back to your Peter Thiel comment earlier about the importance of relationships, I'm just interested in the really early stage companies. Is there any advantage or disadvantage to being tied to a particularly well-known angel group, like Life Science Angels of the Valley or something? They're a very networked group. Or is it considered advantageous to try to crowdfund, for example, you're showing a customer base right out the gate? Or is that considered sort of anti-establishment and delegitimizing? I'm just curious how those seed capital things lead into next round funding considerations.
Anyone want to start?
Not from our perspective, just so you know that. Not from our perspective. We've seen it all. Kickstarter campaigns, all of it.
Well, and I think from a early stage, anytime you can find other sources of funding before you have to go to a mean, venture fund, it's a way to preserve yourself. So angel funding, great idea. Crowdsourcing friends and family. I think it's always good to give yourself as much runway as you can before you have to go to the venture capitalist, because then you're going to have more information for them as well, and it's probably going to be a better valuation.
And are you seeing more crowd-funded companies? Is that a trend that you're really seeing?
You know, we're not so much, at least in classic med tech healthcare, but they are clearly out there. And so it probably somewhat depends on you as the CEO what your end game is, because I think that that's very true. What Lisa's suggesting is, you know, there's a bit more strings attached if you're going to go up the channel on where you're getting the funding. That I think you have to take into consideration. I think there's also, you know, the element of some of the strategic investors as they invest, you know, that might be a pathway to exit where there's some early insight that's beneficial. Some investors bring some specific expertise or access to markets. So, you know, from my view, which is, as I said, I'm new on the venture side, so, you know, take it with a grain of salt. But it's been very interesting to me from the company perspective to think about, are they thinking about clearly enough what their end game is for why they are taking that capital, you know? And I think that just like when you're growing and developing a company, I think that, and the investors are doing that as well, but I think it's a good just discipline to go through as you think about it. In general though, I mean, I think if you could crowd fund, there's some real advantage to that. And, you know, a lot of independence that you get as a company and a CEO when you have that kind of investment.
Well, and then specific to angel investors, their expectations of return on that investment aren't necessarily the same as once you get to the venture capitalists. So it's potentially good money up front to take. And then the reputation helps, you know, especially like we talked about in China, if you have that first investor and they have those relationships, again, it does help.
But one note to be made is that early stage funding and sizes of early rounds have significantly gone up.
Yes.
So something that we used to call Series A is now a seed or pre-seed round. So that it's not to be discounted, because this is actually a serious amount of money. It's not 100, 200K.
Right.
So you're not going to crowdfund yourself to
Great point.
to $1 million, right? To $1.5 million that you need to get somewhere, specifically if you're in medical device. There are different types of companies, and perhaps you can do something with million and you know, something like between 1 and 2 million. But then you have to really think, as you said, you know, what's your end game? Have you thought how much more you'll need? And you know, are you planning to keep your fundraising process forever? And that is a very distracting process from actually building a company and executing, which is what you're doing early on, right?
That was actually just another Peter Thiel comment, by the way, was in his assessment, one of the most significant failures is when you underfund. You know, take advantage of funding certainly enough, but ideally a little bit more for the runway. And in his assessment, that was something that oftentimes wasn't thought through strong enough. So I think that's a great point, Milena. And actually, the Silicon Valley Bank data shows, if you want to go out, you can get that on their Silicon Valley Bank website. They've got actually a great deck on the first half 2016 investment. It's very US oriented, but there's a lot of really interesting insight. And it shows that, to Milena's point, the Series A for MedTech is actually the largest that it's ever been in terms of the total fund taken in Series A. And I think that just speaks to, in the classic MedTech, you know, these, like we were talking earlier on reimbursement, the clinical studies, the reg paths, you know, the need for kind of better demonstrated clinical discipline before you're actually going to commercialize. Okay, last question. Oh, I'm sorry, I thought you had one. No? Right over here.
From the app again. If you are an entrepreneur seeking funding, how would you think through the decision on whether to seek funding from US versus outside of US investors? That's part one. Part two is, if a company has previously raised money from an outside of US VC with no US office, how does that influence your consideration?
So I will let the panel answer, but one other I thought it was a great quote that maybe is germane to this. It was in a New York Times article, and it was talking about specifically when you're taking on capital, how to think about it as, call it the innovator. And it said that describing venture capital relationships, they're part personal, part business, part genuine, part transactional, part carrot, part stick. So the piece that I'm seeing now in terms of considering deploying capital, as well as thinking about taking capital, it may sound a little Pollyannish, but it's the relationship in a lot of ways. And, I even think about when I left Boston Scientific with a group and we started EV3, Erica talked about Warburg Pincus. The interview that I had with Bess Weatherman, where I was kind of interviewing her, if you will, what I wanted to know and what she said was, we are an investor that basically will back our teams kind of, through hell or high water. Like, if we believe in the management team, we believe in the vision, obviously you guys got to perform, but we're there, we're partners. And to me, that's kind of a big consideration, both for the venture investor to invest in management teams, which everyone brought up, as well as taking the capital. Last comments maybe from the group on that.
I was trying to think through the early stage investments, and I got to say, most of the early stage investment that we see is local to whatever region it's in. Mm-hmm. It's more of the later stage kind of growth equity type of investment where we begin to see more money coming in from whether it's some of the larger European funds, some of the family offices, or from Asia in particular coming into later stage rounds. We do not see them in that raw startup early stage, to your point, it's hard. These Series A and seed stage funding is hard. It takes a lot of time by the investor just to help the CEO and the founding team do all the heavy lifting. So I don't see seed money coming cross-border per se, and maybe that's just a bias by my portfolio.
I'd agree with that. I mean, I think there's probably exceptions to that.
Yeah.
But as a normal rule, you're going to go where your lowest hanging fruit is, which you generally have the relationships locally. I mean, to try to go to China in a first round, the challenges that you have in terms of the amount of investment of time that you have to put in there when you're also trying to start a company, the fact that you might have to sign over rights, and the fact that their diligence process is a little bit, it's not as transparent as we're used to. It doesn't necessarily follow traditional timelines. So you might be going, when am I getting this? Where are they at? So I mean, some of those things can factor into it. And I think unless you have somebody on that initial board that says, hey, I can get this and I can get this now, I think those are the caveats. Otherwise, I think you're going to go to what you know.
I think the question was asked by an early stage company who had funding sources from the outside of US, and they're probably not even based in the US. So what I would say, you can take funding sources from anywhere in the world, that's fine. What usually, the challenges with that are usually if when that company comes to you, you look at the cap table or those the really ridiculous terms, you go like, who did that? And then, so the next question, if they're looking for the next round of funding in the US, then the conversation is going to be, we're going to go and kind of redo this whole thing because you have to have normal investment, kind of terms and, all of that. And so that always a challenge, always a challenge, I would say probably most of the time a challenge because team comes to a realization, oh my God, we screwed up. So we need to figure out something else and we need to talk to our investors. It's always a very, very uncomfortable situation. And last answer, and the last, I would say, point on that question, would that company get funded if they didn't have a US office? I mean, I wouldn't fund them. They absolutely have to be here.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
So, I mean, it's our, kind of view. I don't know, J&J's big.
Well, ladies, thank you very much for all your insights and the questions. And Deb and Amy, thanks again. It was a great conference.